think you probably all know who Warren is by now, because if you've been here for the last 2 days and don't know who he is, you really haven't been paying attention. But a very good friend of mine, as you were saying earlier, from many years back. I think a couple of things you may not necessarily know about Warren is that he published a book, his first book, called Churchill and the Islamic World, which came out in 2015. And he is also the editor of a book called Churchill at the Telegraph, which collects articles which Winston Churchill published in the Daily Telegraph as part of his journalistic career, with a foreword by Boris Johnson. I'm not totally sure how you feel about that at this stage, but also I can sort of exclusively preview that he is currently writing a book called Churchill's Great Game, which is about Churchill's relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union throughout his career, and I think that is very relevant to the theme of his talk today, which is on Churchill and military intelligence. So Warren, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Richard. I just want to start with a couple things. Firstly, I want to thank you all for coming to this conference. This has been a lot of fun so far. We've still got another day, but I've been really excited. Also, I just want to say, because I am the president of the East Tennessee Historical Society, if you're not a member, you should join, because this is the kind of stuff that we do. Also, the third thing I'd like to do before I start is manage expectations. I thought it would be a tremendous idea to go after two of the world's leading experts about Winston Churchill, so I gave myself quite a challenge. So let's jump into this. Now, you might know, you probably have some idea that Winston Churchill was very interested in military intelligence. This is something that's been written about by loads of historians, including Richard, including Alan, most notably Christopher Andrew, and most notably David Stafford. Thank you. I almost said Storrs. David Stafford. Winston had a real love of intelligence. He was sort of obsessed with it. And Christopher Andrews said that scarcely there was any leader in any of the 20th century that was better posed to use military intelligence that came into him. He would often actually read intercepts, raw intelligence data, and we know this from a person named, a historian named Robin Dyer, I think is his last name, who wrote about Churchill personally reading the raw intelligence transcripts from Turkey, which is stuff that I've used for my own work. He would basically go through, he had a deep love of intelligence operations. He would go in and get these intercepts. He was interested in signals intelligence. He would read the raw data stuff that came from what we now know as GCHQ. He was also deeply interested in counterintelligence and spying. He loved to use different types of intrigue and sort of action, the kind of romance. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to sort of talk about this stuff today. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what he did in the Second World War, but more importantly, perhaps something you don't know or haven't thought about, is where this idea, this love of intelligence and intrigue and spying came from Winston, is what I'll be looking at. And this comes, one of the things you might not know about me is when I was a professor, I taught intelligence at Aberystwyth. So some of the things you can see here, Churchill was very, very interested. We know that's the Enigma machine. You're all familiar with the Enigma machine, so Churchill was very interested in this. He helped fund and set up Alan Turing to help bust and break the Enigma code. He also, of course, famously set up the SOE, which is the Special Operation of the Executive. And he would go on and encourage things like Operation Mincemeat, as well as other things. And you can see he was interested in weapons. Sorry, I'm looking at that and this, and it's kind of confusing me. And you can see that he was interested in all these kinds of things. Now, Operation Mincemeat, which was one of the systems, or one of the operations, was where they took a soldier. This is a picture, sorry, it's quite graphic. And they put some fake plans on him. Does anyone ever heard of Operation Mincemeat? Yeah, good. So you all know. And they dumped him over the seas. The Germans intercepted this and used it. Some of the other things that Churchill was a big fan of was the double cross system, which is what this insignia here, which is the XX, system. What would you call it? The XX committee? which obviously a double cross. And what they would do in the double cross operations is they would take German intelligence officers and flip them and use them as counterintelligence against the Germans, in particular to create a thing called Operation Fortitude, or more specifically Fortitude South, which was to convince the Germans that in fact the D-Day landings would not be in Normandy, but would be at Calais. And there were enormous operations that went into Operation Fortitude that Churchill sort of happily looked over. And one of my favorite stories of the double cross system, as a part of this operation, there was an agent who had been he was a Spanish man. His name was Juan Garcia, and Juan Garcia had been an intelligence operative in the Spanish Civil War that had been flipped, was working for the British as a counter operative. He was known as Agent Garbo, and Agent Garbo set up a whole system of fictitious agents that he was feeding the Germans. So he was giving them all kinds of counterintelligence that was helping out what Churchill, the plan for D-Day. And in the end, I think he had 27 operatives, they weren't real, and he would get a salary from the Germans for each one of these operatives. So not only is he feeding them misinformation, he's also making money on it, which I just think is tremendous. And of course, as a part of Operation Fortitude, Patton, and I'm sure Patton was very upset about this, got to be in charge of a bunch of inflatable tanks because they were trying to convince them that there would be another attack. And they knew that the Germans were afraid of Patton. So Patton got to pretend like he was going to invade. Of course, he did later on. But the question is, where did a lot of this stuff come from? I mean, when he set up the SOE, one of the things, as we know, is Churchill was a man of action. So Churchill told the SOE when he set them up to go forth and to set Europe ablaze. It's literally what he said. And he loved this idea of going behind the scenes, blowing up bridges, having action, and this kind of thing. And so, and you can see a lot of this stuff comes out in the writings again of David Stafford. But where does this romance come from? Well, a lot of it came from his youth. And this is where I said earlier a lot of my own thinking about Churchill was inspired by Richard and his work, is that if you look at Churchill's youth, you can kind of see a lot of where his thinking comes from. So a lot of the kind of intrigue and stuff, of course, that was being written in Victorian Britain is about guys working behind the lines. And you don't have to look any further than Kipling in the book Kim to know what I'm talking about the intrigue in Asia, which Churchill himself finds himself in later on. But the first place that we should start our story is in Cuba, where Churchill, after he left Sandhurst, basically goes to Cuba as a correspondent for the Daily Graphic. And while he's in Cuba, he's actually attached with the Spanish forces, not the American forces or the Cuban forces. And so he's there, and what's really interesting is that before he goes there, he has to get permission from his military officers, because he had joined the 4th Hussars at that point. And so he went to his commander, Lord Wolseley, and he asked for permission to go. And he told a friend of his, but he said, before you go, you've got to talk to General E.F. Chapman, who is the director of military intelligence. I want to pause for a second. In this time, the late 1800s, military intelligence, particularly in Britain, isn't anything like intelligence today. MI5, MI6 wasn't even set up yet. So the way intelligence was done was sort of back rooms, gentlemen smoking pipes, usually often in the Royal Geographic Society, places like that. Intelligence was something gentlemen did, but it wasn't necessarily an organized thing. And this actually leads to lots of problems, unsurprisingly. But as you move towards the First World War, historically, it has to become more and more professionalized. So Churchill goes and he asks E.F. Chapman if he can go to Cuba, and he gives him permission. But he also is given loads of maps. He's given maps, and he's told what to do. And he's told to collect information and statistics on various points, particularly on the effect of a new bullet, its penetration and striking power. And so Churchill had joined the well-established tradition of gentlemen spying. So this is the bullet in question. This is a Mauser bullet. It's a 757 millimeter Mauser. It's for an 1893 Mauser rifle. And what makes this a really remarkable invention, let's go back in time and imagine the technology at the time. This is a smokeless, powderless, rimless, bolt-action cartridge rifle. Now, Britain's still using Martini rifles. Some of those would create plumes of smoke. So when you're in a tactical situation and you can see a plume of smoke, you give your position away. Well, suddenly the Spanish are using a rifle that was kind of more advanced. And the British needed to have the ability to sort of catch up with this technology. And what's really interesting is this exact rifle plays a major role in the Boer War later on. So Churchill's actually there writing, of course, about what's going on in Cuba, but also gathering information. So in many ways, Churchill is literally a part of military intelligence now. Now, while he's there, of course, he does write for the Daily Graphic. He does write about the rifles and the bullets and what it's like and how you can see plumes of smoke. And he talks about it being very similar to the Lee Metford rifles, which Britain used. But he also noticed some other things while he was in Cuba that I think stuck with him the rest of his life about how powerful insurgencies can be, guerrilla war. One of the things that left an impression on him is that he would ask the sort of Spanish if they knew where the enemy was, and the Spanish would say they were everywhere and nowhere. And that's something that stuck with Churchill, as we'll see when we talk about what he wanted the SOE to do in France and what he expected the French resistance to be capable of. And so increasingly he began to learn while he was based there in Cuba that the Spanish Empire had kind of lost the hearts and mind of the Cuban people. They didn't really want the Spanish there anymore. And he became convinced that if a guerrilla force could not, if an imperial force could not contain the hearts and minds of the people, that a guerrilla force would be able to kind of be everywhere and nowhere. And so as a result, there would be no way to beat them. And he even went on to say in one of his, in fact, his last publication while he was in Cuba, that even Emperor William, so he's talking about the Kaiser, and all of the German army would take 20 years to crush this revolt. So it would be impossible. So this is one of the lessons he learned about intelligence, is that it doesn't matter how powerful the invading colonial army is, as long as they're sympathetic with the guerrilla fighters, there's nothing that can be done. So the next stage that we'll be talking about, Churchill does literally find himself in the Great Game. Now, has anyone here read Kipling? Has anyone read Kim? A couple of us, that's good. So Kipling, of course, wrote in the novel Kim about the Great Game. And what the Great Game is, for those of you that don't know, is the sort of Cold War of the 19th century. And that basically pitted the British Empire against the Russian Empire for control of the Hindu Kush and basically control of Central Asia. Because the worry that the British had was that if Russia could control the mountains, they could just come down and take India. And so there was a sort of bloodless war that went back and forth, and there was lots of spying and lots of intrigue. Well, Churchill gets sent out to India, and he, again, writes as a war correspondent, which I think is very important for the Daily Telegraph and the Allahabad Pioneer. And so Churchill is basically out there, and he is sort of spending a lot of time reading, but he gets called up to go to the Malakand to go on some sort of punitive expeditions because some of the, in particular, Islamic tribes had rebelled against Britain. And he had suspected Russia. Now, this is a sort of loaded thing. He was already, when he was at Harrow, writing essays about how one day he would save Russia, fight off the great Russian bear, I think is what the phrase he used. He imagined himself as a sort of hero saving Britain from Russia. So there's already sort of a preloaded thing, but that's because we're inside the context of the Great Game in the 19th century. So Churchill goes there suspecting Russia the whole time. And it's probably an important thing to note that his father was the Secretary of India at one point, and his father also had a deep distrust of Russia and what Russia was trying to do in India. Churchill got a lot of his politics from his father. And one of the things that basically he walks into while he's there, this is the sort of area I was talking about. I've fallen behind here. So here's Churchill in India. Is that basically the Russians had been taking rifles and giving them to these sort of tribes, these Afridis, various different types of tribes, and sort of getting them to get excited and go out and fight the British. And there are a few leaders. One was called the Mad Mullah, who thought that he was invincible, that were basically being riled up, he thought, by the Russians. And he started making friends with various intelligence officers, civil intelligence officers, who argued the same thing. And they said that that the Emir of Afghanistan, and you have to understand that Afghanistan is being controlled both by Russia and Britain, and there's lots of political cartoons that kind of illustrate this. In fact, maybe, no, I didn't bring it. Sorry, guys. That basically Afghanistan, so that the Emir was kind of in there playing both sides against the middle, which of course they were. And so he meets up with a guy named Dean, who is an intelligence officer. And Dean's been reporting back that the Emir of Afghanistan had been emboldened by the Turkish victory in the Greco-Turkish War, and that he had opened up shops to sell rifles and cartridges on the cheap to different tribesmen. And that basically these things were all being pushed by Russia. So Churchill saw this, and he also talked about different tribes in the Lehman Valley, that among these rifles that they found, some of them were British rifles that had been captured when they're out doing their sort of policing, that they'd gotten in raids, but that also they found at least 300 Russian rifles as a part of it. So increasingly, Churchill's beginning to suspect Russia. Now, while he's out there, he makes a friend with a guy named Captain Henry Stanton, who is an intelligence officer. Churchill starts going around, and remember that Churchill's a cavalry officer. And he said that Henry Stanton was a good fellow, he knows all sorts of things, and that they would go around collecting intelligence and doing reconnaissance as cavalry officers. So they would ride it forward, figure out if there were any enemy positions, literally trying to figure out the lay of the land. Because one of the things you have to remember again in the 19th century is intelligence often is literally about geography. You know, and this all starts in the Crimean War, when you have to really start talking about using geography as intelligence. So they would send forth cavalry officers on their horse because they're quick, and they would have them sort of draw maps and try to figure out where locations were. So Churchill starts doing this kind of reconnaissance work, and as working on the frontier. And so he would try to find the location of the enemy, bring it back, bring that to other intelligence officers who were the civil intelligence officers. Now, the civil intelligence officers would then feed that back, so there's a sort of chain of command. Well, in Churchill's book, The Malacan Field Force, he starts talking about, and he got into a lot of trouble with this because he's kind of talking out of rank. Well, there's a huge kind of problem between the communications between the military officers of intelligence and the civilian officers of intelligence, because it's difficult for the two to kind of talk, so you get lots of miscommunication. So he's already trying to reorganize how intelligence is collected in the field. And that it's basically going to take better communication between the civil branch and the military branch in the field to make these things happen. So that's one of the things about intelligence that Churchill learned during his time in Afghanistan. He would then go on to fight in the River War. Now, this is when I think he gets a real taste for intelligence and intelligence operation. He basically wasn't supposed to be there. He gets his mother to convince Kitchener, and through various channels, that he should be there, although he has to avoid Kitchener because Kitchener's one of the people that he's upset, telling everybody how they should be running intelligence, among other things. And so he basically gets his very first lesson in counterintelligence there. This is one of my favorite stories. He's really excited. He's out on a reconnaissance patrol as they're making their way down towards Omdurman. And he comes upon a deserted camp, and he finds what he described, this is according to the first edition of the River War, a dervish in a patch jibba armed with several spears emerged from the bushes. And Churchill immediately captured this fierce warrior and returned him to camp. Churchill later wrote that he was very proud of his prisoner, ... until he reached the army. And it was then when he reached the army that he learned that the person that he captured was actually a spy who'd been working for the army and had been spying on Omdurman, and now he turned to the news. So he was made fun of quite heavily. He got quite upset. He was very embarrassed, and he pleaded with other correspondents that were there not to telegraph about the episode back to the thing. And what's interesting is this story only appears in the first edition of this book, which only ran for 1 year. He cut it out himself and hoped that it would be lost to time, which I think is quite funny. So, but what's also interesting about this episode, so you can see that he's sort of caught up in it. And when he sat down to write his book afterwards, he had to work with Ronald Wingate. Now, Ronald Wingate was in charge of military intelligence for Kitchener and in the Anglo-Dervish War. And what's really interesting there is he even dedicates the whole book to the work that Ronald Wingate had done. And he couldn't be more proud of the intelligence work that was done by the Egyptian army and the intelligence branch that was under Kitchener at that point. He said that they worked to extraordinary efficiency and noted that Kitchener could use the intelligence department well better than anyone and had assiduously collected every scrap of information. And as they closed in on Khartoum, he said that the spies pervaded all the towns and that just before the fall of Khartoum, Sudan were the objects of ceaseless scrutiny. Up the great river within the wall of Omdurman and into the arsenal, into the treasury, into the mosque, into the Khalifa's house itself. The spies and secret agents of the government, disguised as traders, as warriors, or as women, worked stealthily in their way. And you could see that Churchill was sort of very enamored of this. So Churchill sees the power of intelligence and having a vast spy network. And if you'll think about Operation Double Cross, that's exactly what he's done in the Second World War. So his next military assignment would see him join the Second Boer War. Oh, that's the Battle of Omdurman. All right, we're up to the Second Boer War now. I'm trying to get through. You've all had a lot of Churchill today. But he was a war correspondent this time for the Morning Post. Now, in between going to the Boer War and leaving Egypt, he tried to stand for Parliament, but he was not successful. Actually, no, that hasn't happened yet. Never mind, that happens in between his two books. 1899?
It's before he goes to the Boer War, though.
Is it? Yeah, okay, I was right then. Good for me. I'm not nervous at all. So one of the interesting things that happens with Churchill in this is that right away, not instantaneously, but right away, he's with a group, and the group that he's with, the train gets exploded. He's taken as a prisoner of war. And he insists that he should be let go because he's just a journalist. He's not anybody important. And he tells his warden that basically, and they write to the Boer General Joubert, and he wrote that he heavily implied that Churchill himself was probably a spy, and despite his press credentials, it appears entirely otherwise. And so that he should be watched and guarded as possibly close, otherwise he could still do them a lot of harm. And so Churchill basically is held there under the belief that he is a spy, and then of course he escapes. Churchill escapes from the school where he was being held captive. And what I think is really interesting about this is, of course, he had to move under cover of darkness until he eventually made it back to Pretoria. And when he did this, he realized that if he was captured, he would be tried and hung as a spy. So he is sort of living the life of being an intelligence operative. But there are other things besides just kind of experiencing this. I mean, later on, during the sort of later phase in the second book about going to Johannesburg, he talks about going and taking, again, information behind enemy lines on a bicycle. And I love the idea of thinking him just sort of cycling with this like top secret information that he used to talk to Ian Hamilton about. But there are other things I think that are really interesting that he learns there. And one of the lessons that he learns while he was there, and this in part, he's a part of the problem and he kind of recognizes that, has to do with censorship of the free press. And the second one is sort of about signals intelligence. Now, there are a few problems that I think anyone can talk about. Anyone who studied the Boer War knows that Britain was in a lot of trouble in the Boer War. One of the instances that Churchill himself talks about, and where I take the title for the actual paper, this paper, by the way, was published in Allen's book in the Cambridge Companion, was that there was a man who was in charge of intelligence. He was an Irishman named Major John Ardagh, and he wrote to General Rutgers Buller, who was in charge, and Lord Lansdowne, who was in charge of the British position in South Africa, and he said basically that they were criminally underfunded, and that it would take nearly, I'm trying to find the exact number, basically loads and loads of divisions. And he wrote this enormous sort of memo, almost a book, about all the things Britain would need to do if they were going to be successful in South Africa. And he gave it over to Lord Lansdowne, who promptly returned it within the hour and said he already knew everything he needed to know to win this war. And so basically, shortly after that, Britain had several catastrophic defeats at Stormberg, Mines, Magersfontein, and Colenso during what's called the Black Week. And ultimately, they were dismissed and replaced with Frederick Roberts and General Kitchener, who had been in the Anglo-Dervish War. So you have this sort of arrogance of people getting good intelligence, but not listening to the intelligence. This is something Churchill was always good at, was listening to the intelligence that he got and trying to interpret it and actually listen to it. Now, the next thing about the correspondence, this is unbelievable to me. So in terms of censorship and the way that worked in the Boer War, there were over 88 newspaper correspondents in the press corps alone, the official British press corps. So that's 88 newspaper, 276 named press correspondents, many of whom were also military officers. All of this around what would be censored and what wouldn't was down to one person controlling all of this. His name was Major Jones. I don't know his first name. And he was in charge of all press relations for the entire country. So obviously, this created a situation that was almost a pandemonium. I mean, any amount of information could come across at any time. I've jumped ahead. And so there were basically no rules. So Churchill, being a war correspondent, and of course he got later the British sort of passed a rule, almost using Churchill as an example, about why you shouldn't let your actual people in the military be war correspondents, because he was publishing his letters without any kind of censorship. And he himself cites in a article that he wrote for the military magazine that people would give away positions. You know, they would write to the newspaper and say, wow, we saw this many, you know, the British were hiding in this place. And the Boers, of course, would read the information, and then they would plan their attacks based on that information. And so he became really interested in how censorship works. And I think that's one of the most interesting things, is that he also understood that you had to really control the information, right? And not only control it, but you have to fund the guys who are controlling it. So when he does eventually enter Parliament, even as in the first couple of years while the Boer War is still going on, which I think formally ended in 1902, I think that's right, that basically he's immediately arguing for there to fund the British intelligence branch inside the military. And when he increasingly makes this case, he was horrified to learn that there were only 16 intelligence officers in all of the British military. And he immediately was like, well, the Germans have 200. So we have to start increasing funding. The other thing to mention about this is what would later be called the D notice. So when Churchill becomes, at the Foreign Office, let me start over. When Churchill goes to the Board of Trade and then eventually goes to Home Office and then later into the First Lord of the Admiralty, he set up a system whereby he created a thing called the D notice that basically brought in the major newspapers who would agree to kind of self-censor things in order not to let things seep out. So Churchill really is really interested in the flow of information and how that works. And so you can see these things. That's one of the things, of course, he also learned in Cuba, and how the press and how these different things work together, I think, are really important in Churchill's mind. So as he moves through Parliament and starts becoming into sort of cabinet positions, as Home Secretary, he would also help pass and argue for the Official Secrets Act in 1911, where he would also work with these two gentlemen who are on the PowerPoint behind me, Vernon Kill and Mansfield Cumming. Does anyone know who Mansfield Cummings is? What if I told you he's more colloquially known as C? Does that mean anything? What if I told you in James Bond he was called M? Mansfield Cummings is the founder of MI6, and Vernon Kell is the founder of MI5. And so Churchill worked behind the scenes, and a lot of that element of his sort of foray into intelligence work is in David Stafford's book. And it's definitely worth reading. But he went to extreme lengths to help set up these formalized intelligence networks when he was Home Secretary and then later at the First Lord of the Admiralty. And all of that was set up the D notice system as a result of the Algiers crisis. Now, just going briefly back to the Boer War, and I want to put this in because this is one of the most remarkable things about this. So Churchill was also really deeply interested in intelligence, but technology. And he thought that you could solve a lot of the issues around intelligence with technology. He was a big fan of the telegraph. Remember that had just sort of come out. But the problem in Afghanistan, and particularly in the Boer War, was that they would cut the telegraph line, so you can't get the information across. So Churchill, in one of the magazines that he wrote for the military magazine, came up with a couple of ideas, one of which is kind of interesting, one of which is terrible. The first idea is that in order to communicate to artillery officers where they should fire, they should use different colors of gunpowder, so that you might have a purple plume of smoke, so you would know that all the artillery officers would know where to focus. So he sort of talks about using different types of colored smoke to communicate for different artillery positions, which I think is kind of interesting. That's one of the things I love about Winston Churchill is he's nothing if not an ideas man. I mean, he's obviously a man of action, but he's also a thinker. The other idea he had was less, I think, glorious, and not necessarily as bad as him trying to be there on D-Day, but maybe close. So because he, as a reconnaissance officer, would move back and forth between generals and forward positions, he often got frustrated by the fact that the position of the general would be unknown, and he'd get lost, and it'd take forever to get him the information. So he developed a system whereby general officers or their attending officers would have a balloon, so you could always find them. Churchill didn't seem to pay much mind to the fact that would mean your enemies would know where your generals were. So that's also one of my favorite sort of Churchillian things. But Churchill, as a part of the Boer War, and in the same magazine, was very frustrated. And this goes back to that rifle. He was very frustrated with British tactics in the Boer War and wrote about the fact that the Boer tactics were simply had outclassed the British. I mean, to make a long thing very short, Britain continued to use the same military tactics that they had for almost 100 years, where they would line up and kind of walk, in a line and take their shots using the same sort of stuff, whereas the Boers fought more like the Americans did in the American Revolution. They would hide, they had snipers, they had powderless guns. And I have this picture of a blockhouse in South Africa, because when I was first doing the research for this project, it was just about the time I first came back here to East Tennessee. And one of the things that I found remarkable is that the British system for control in Tennessee and the Carolinas, using blockhouses and forts like Fort Armistead or Fort Prince George, or Prince Edward, was basically literally the same sort of tactical game plan that they were using 100 years later in South Africa. So you can see why Churchill would be frustrated with a military that kept doing the exact same thing over and over again and not learning their lessons, because it took a very long time for them to change their tactics. Now, eventually, when Kitchener was in charge of the British effort in the Boer War, they did change tactics completely, but that also led to some pretty severe, catastrophic things in terms of humanitarianism in the Boer War, because Kitchener worked out that you can kind of systematically shut this thing down, and that's where we get the term concentration camps from. So it was a complex situation that had to be sorted out, which Kitchener did, but it took a huge change of tactics to do it. So basically, I want to conclude and leave you with the idea that Churchill learned some significant lessons in his early life that he later then applied in the war effort. And the first is, in the Cuban War, he learned about the power of a guerrilla insurrection. And what I mean by that is when he told the SOE to set Europe ablaze, he believed that they would have the same kind of power that the guerrillas had in Cuba. Now, of course, we know historically from the evidence that was not the case. The SOE, they blew up bridges and they were sort of an annoyance, but the amount of money that went into them didn't cause anywhere near the amount of damage that we like to think that it did. Now, having said that, I'd really like to watch the Gentlemanly Warfare movie that just came out about the SOE. I've not seen it yet. He also learned about the work of reconnaissance operations and how recon should work and work with civilian military intelligence, how you couldn't do that inside of an existing what you'd call IC in the trade, which is intelligence community structure. So he helped Vernon Kell and Mansfield Cumming create a new one, where you could blend these things together, where civilians could talk to military and there'd be common language and thought. He was also, wait, what's that? He was also heavily invested in the power of spies. And that's something he learned from the Boer War and, of course, from the Anglo-Sudanese War. That if you could get a network of spies into a place, it would be tremendously effective. And he famously said that the truth, in wartime, the truth is so precious, it has to be guarded by a bodyguard of lies. And so that's exactly something he believed in, which is why he had all these deceptions like Fortitude South, and these are things he really encouraged. And so these are all things that came from his own experience as a not a child soldier, but as a young soldier during the Victorian era that he brought into the 20th century. And as technology advanced, so did his thinking around how that technology could be used. So in conclusion, I'll say most of his ideas were pretty good. Balloons for your generals, not great. Being at D-Day, not a great idea. But I think for the best of it, his interest in intelligence served not just him and not just Britain, but the Allied cause very well. Thank you very much. I will take questions now.
The dark nails wasn't a good idea.
Well, no. That's a complex question, and I've written a book about it you can buy. Thanks, Dad. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You spoke about the work that Churchill did to develop MI5, MI6 agencies. You were saying to sort of synthesize the gap between military and civilian intelligence efforts. Can you speak a little more specifically on what sort of work that required as far as changing language, that sort of thing?
So it wasn't. So that's a great question, number one, and a lot of it came down to funding structures and knowing who to talk to in the right places at the right time. Because like I said, there had been a tradition in the Victorian era, going back probably to Palmerston, maybe before, maybe really to the Napoleonic era, that this is something gentlemen did, and it was understood, and it was handled, everything was informally done. And it was just sort of rumors and how rumors worked. And everybody, you have to understand, in the middle of the 19th century, von Clausewitz writes On War, and everybody read On War. And in On War, von Clausewitz says, you don't need spies. Spies that's dishonorable. That's not what we do in the West. That's not how you fight a war. So spying, again, was kind of away from military practice. And in fact, if you look at the late 19th century, not just in Britain, but in any of the major things, particularly the French intelligence operations, any European intelligence operations, if you're involved with intelligence, it's dirty. I mean, that's almost the way it's written about, is like, oh, he's an intelligence guy. That's gross. And it's not really until the Boer War for Britain, now it's different for different countries, that it's like, actually, this is really useful and we should professionalize it. And so it took really from about 1902, the end of the Boer War, up into the founding, which I think was 1909, of MI6 and MI5, to kind of get the funding structures in place, work out how that would work. You know, it took a lot of time. It was a process. Who do you want, and how do you have an officer that can communicate with different branches of the military at the same time, and who should be responsible for what? And you know, even to this day, the intelligence community still has problems with jurisdiction and figuring out who's responsible for what. But a lot of the birth of that comes out of the Boer War and those late 19th century conflicts for Britain. Yes, sir.
Not a comment, not a question, but a comment. In the 1960s, there was a movie called The Man Who Never Was that was published about the body that was dropped with the plans for the invasion of Calais, which caused Hitler to delay the response to Normandy because he was convinced that the actual landing was going to be at Calais. The Man Who Never Was.
The film, yeah, and I have seen that film, and there's a fantastic book by an English author named Ben. Oh, we've done stuff. Yeah, Ben McIntyre, who wrote a book about Operation Mincemeat and about the sort of deception that took place in the Second World War. And if you've not read it, I would absolutely recommend it to you. It's a fantastic book. And yes.
Can I ask a dumb question?
Yes, please.
As someone who is dramatically unfamiliar with Winston Churchill, clarifying question, you said he did serve in the military, right?
Yes.
How long?
So he served from 1895 through to about 1899. I'm going to defer to Alan, but
Well, 1895 to 99, then he becomes a war correspondent for the Second World War, but then he rejoins the sort of South African Light Horse to stay on there, so you can argue sort of 1900.
and then of course in the First World War
Yeah,
as well.
and he stays on as a reservist, and then in the First World War after the Dardanelles, he commands a battalion on the Western Front in Belgium for a few months at the beginning of 1916.
So heavily involved with the military. But also, I mean, and what's interesting is you might think of Churchill as a soldier. I mean, there are lots of books written about that. There are significantly less books written about Churchill as a writer, which is interesting because by the early 1900s, that was his profession. And there's a great book called Mr. Churchill's Profession about him as a writer. I mean, because of this thing in the Boer War where he was captured and then escaped, he became a national, like a household name. And he turned that into a fantastic writing career and made loads of money. I mean, that's essentially what his living was as a writer. So he was very cleverly able to marry those things as a writer and a member of the military until the military was like, hey, we can't really do that anymore because of the censorship problems, which I think is really interesting. Yes, sir.
Question on intelligence, espionage, and all that. I've read all that on World War II and the Normandy invasion. You see that rubberized tanks and all that. It just seems to me that somebody should have known about all that, and I'm directing this to either one of you. Does that ever surprise you that the Germans never did know?
Well, so I'll defer to what Alan says, but let me jump in first. One, so you have two things going on. One, a lot of the way the Germans were able to gather intelligence was through aerial reconnaissance. So they're seeing these things from the air and they look like actual tanks. Now, they're going to have people on the ground, but as we saw, they had a really difficult time penetrating the kind of British system of intelligence. And if they did, they would get flipped and get sent back, which brings me to my final point, and that is that the German intelligence, military intelligence operation department was called the Abwehr. The Abwehr, and I've read a couple articles about this, basically opposed the Nazis. These are like old school, standard military guys, Prussian, don't really like the Nazis, don't really like Hitler. And that's not true for all of them, but by and large, the culture of the Abwehr was very opposed to Nazism. And so there is an argument, and I don't know if it's true or not, or if we'll ever know, that they sort of intentionally were not great at their jobs because they kind of didn't want Hitler in charge anymore. Now, I don't know how much I believe that, but I have read two articles that sort of make that case. Alan, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, well, just picking up on your first point, it's very interesting in the memoirs of General Morgan. He talks about trying to sort of set up some of these deception plans and deception operations and feints prior to D-Day. And talking about putting the dummy tanks in place and all of this. And of course then to make that successful, as you've said, you've got to have the enemy overflying it and seeing it. And the problem he has is that the RAF won't allow any of the Luftwaffe to get into their airspace. So they're limiting what they're actually able to see. But I think the point, going back to all of these presentations, is at the time, Churchill and Eisenhower didn't know how much the Germans knew or didn't know. And it was a huge fear going into Operation Overlord that actually all of these things would have been seen and that the enemy would have been sort of better prepared for them. But all the evidence is that when they do go across, that actually the Germans either hadn't seen these things or failed to appreciate their significance, or had fallen for some of these deception plans. So believed actually that the D-Day assault wasn't the whole force, and that there was another force that was going to come across, and that there's plenty of evidence that Hitler was still convinced for days after the 6th of June that there might be another attack in the Pas-de-Calais area, and so does hold back sort of key forces.
And I would just add that when I taught, I did a couple classes on what we call strategic deception, which is what Operation Fortitude was. You, at a grand level, have to convince your enemy that what you're doing is not the thing that you're doing. And ultimately the trick, and you can see this at Pearl Harbor, you can see this in Operation Fortitude, in the European theater, is that your opponent already has to have the idea of what they want to happen. Because everyone, when they look at information, has their own sort of bias. And they will look at something and they'll find the narrative they want to believe. And I do think that British intelligence had worked out that Hitler believed there'd be an attack at Calais. And so they fed him the information he wanted to hear. And the same was true for the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. They knew that America thought that Pearl Harbor was invincible, so they let them believe it. And so it's about creating a narrative. It's not just one thing, hey, this is going to happen. It's a process, and you have to have lots of supporting stuff. But that essentially, I'm telling you something you already believe. So it's going to be a lot easier for you to believe that thing. And then I'll do something else. It works like a magic trick. You look at the birdie, and then, you know, I'll take your money out of your pocket over here. I mean, that's the... Yes, sir.
I was just going to say a huge part of that deception was that being on premises in that part of England, very visible, really, and there were a lot of spies around that knew what Patton was like. I think that contributed a huge portion.
Oh, and I agree. It would be inconceivable for the German high command, who all knew Patton, that Patton would not be involved. It was beyond their thinking that would be the case. And Eisenhower knew that, which is why he gets sent down there. And plus, he'd kind of upset some people because Patton liked to upset people. But I thought that the other day when you were talking about this, Alan, you made a tremendously interesting point that with the fictional First Army that Patton was with, they used lots of radio noise in that part. You know, and that was one of the things that the Germans were good at getting. So they could hear all the fake signals about whatever, and they just put out all the noise, so it sounded like there were loads of people there. And so again, it's just about feeding them the narrative that they think is already in existence, that confirmation bias. Any other questions for me? Okay, thank you very much. We'll have a break.